We've not stepped up. We've just not stepped up. In my 40 years of working in international schools, we haven't stepped up. There are things that you are doing that minimally, they don't work. And other things, which if you're following the research, which you should be doing as a leader, they're harmful.
You're listening to the Blue Skies Leadership Podcast, featuring discussions with international school leaders about the future of education. The podcast embodies the spirit of reciprocity by sharing strategies and change initiatives from leading schools around the world. Here are your hosts, Dan Kerr and Daniel Mendes.
Hey, Daniel, listen, I got to tell you, I love that conversation we had yesterday about how we got into international education in the first place. That line about how international education gave us a career, but it also gave us our wives.
We're celebrating our 20th year in international education, and we were in the same cohort going into Moscow at the Anglo-American School of Moscow, which unfortunately is no longer an amazing school. Of course, we're doing all the newbie things of going for dinner and this and that. And so I just met Jennifer through the cohort, and we've been together ever since. I'm probably the only person that's gone to Russia to meet an American wife.
I love that.
How did you meet Jocelyn?
Well, so Jocelyn started her teaching career in London and did that a couple of years before she jumped to Abu Dhabi. And my first international gig was in Abu Dhabi. So I got off a plane, picked up at the airport by our principal, and he had forgotten the keys at a returning faculty party. So our pit stop was to go where the party was to get the keys, knocked on the door, and who opens the door but Jocelyn? And it just so happens that we were born and raised about 3 hours away from each other in Nova Scotia, Canada. So I had to go all the way to Abu Dhabi to find my wife buried in the Abu Dhabi sand. So it's pretty cool how that all brings everyone together.
I owe a lot to international education, and we owe a lot to this next guest that we have coming up on our show.
Yeah, our next guest kind of paved the way for a lot of us and showed us what great really looks like. And it's been a fun couple of days thinking about this morning. So yeah, excited to get Bambi Betts on our show this morning.
We are here today with Bambi Betts, a true icon in the world of international education. Bambi has dedicated her life to the betterment of international schools and has left an indelible mark on countless educators and students around the globe.
Bambi's contributions really are remarkable. As the director of the Principals Training Center, she has shaped the leadership of international schools for over 3 decades, but her influence doesn't stop there. She's also the founder of training centers for teachers, teacher leaders, counselors, and governance members, ensuring that every facet of an international school benefits from her expertise.
With over 35 years of experience as a director, principal, and teacher in international schools, Bambi's insights are unparalleled. She's consulted with over 150 schools worldwide, guiding them on everything from assessment and curriculum leadership to faculty evaluation and governance.
And if that weren't enough, Bambi also serves on the governing boards of international schools in Haiti, Cambodia, China, and Saudi Arabia. She's a founding member of the Academy for International School Heads and the president of the Overseas Schools Assistance Corporation.
Bambi's commitment to international education is truly extraordinary. She embodies the spirit of collaboration, innovation, and unwavering dedication to excellence that we strive to highlight on this show.
We are incredibly honored to have Bambi Betts with us today. Welcome, Bambi, to our show.
I really appreciate the opportunity, and thank you for thinking of us. And really great work that you're doing and amplifying the work. So keep it going.
Bambi, what we do with all of our guests, we start with the first question. And it's essentially, what does a blue sky vision of school look like for you? And where's the world of international schools heading? Maybe where should it be heading? And what should we all be prioritizing to bring this vision to life? Can you speak to that blue sky vision this morning for us?
That's the fun part, right, of being in the world that we live in, is that we get to imagine. And it doesn't happen if you don't imagine it. That's my sense of it. There's a long list of things. Because what we've tried to do through the Principals Training Center and the other training centers and the other organizations and agencies and things that we've started, there's the practical side of it is the way we tend to approach it. And I know some of the podcasts that you've had and the ones that we hear are very importantly philosophical and directional and et cetera. We try to take that and say, okay, great. Those are all true. How do you actually make it happen sooner rather than later? That's kind of the point of view that I would speak from.
Mm-hmm.
But I do have a long list. Okay. So
give it to us.
Yeah. And some of them are verbs, things that we definitely need to do. Also tend to speak a little bit from the leadership point of view, because that's kind of my life has been, and our organizations have really evolved to really be focusing on leadership, because we've understood without that, it's going to be pretty accidental, one person at a time.
Yeah.
Some of the things that are in my vision of this, and some of them I've lived through, so I don't know that they're that future. I think sometimes we think like, what should it be? I'm getting old now, and we're still talking about what should it look like, well, when is that going to happen? In no particular order, although one of them I think is really important, is that when you're thinking about the place called school, is that you have to start with an understanding of how learning happens and what makes it stick. So everything else kind of flows from, we say we're in the learning business. If that's true, then what are all the things that we need to know about learning so that we can create an organization, a place called school, where that can happen? And then the second part, making it stick, because it's not good enough for just to have that happen while you're in that place. It has to go someplace. And we've taken that idea kind of to the ultimate that we can. So we got to know how learning happens at various stages of life, what makes it stick. And then we have to take up the responsibility of translating what that looks like into these formal learning environments, if we're going to assume that there is a thing called school. And I'll probably keep saying that, because I don't know whether that, if you took the premise of, okay, everybody needs to learn, there are things worth learning, and there are things that are worth learning that take you into the rest of your life, et cetera. We all have to be very knowledgeable about that. A second part of that would be that you have to focus on quality teaching. If you're going to have a teacher in a classroom with kids, and that's part of your assumptions, and we can pick apart all the assumptions, and I know some of the other podcasts have done that. They're picking apart the assumptions. Right now, the assumption is there's going to be a teacher. If that is the case, and we have lots of research on, if you're going to have a teacher, that is going to be the number one thing that is going to influence learning. If you are willing to accept that, then that means that 80% of your resources should be going to quality teaching. And what does that look like? And what are all the practical things that lead to that? And some of the practical things we have ourselves tried to be part of, things like having this international standards of practice, which we, together with the PTC, I'll call it the Principals Training Center, and then the AISH, which is the Academy for International School Heads, and other researchers put together those international standards of practice, and then started to help people understand what do you do, with those, and how does that actually look? And not that we necessarily knew or know, but we've made it our job through our nonprofit work to understand it better and to put that out in front of people. So understanding how learning happens and how does it stick, and then the responsibility to do something about it, not just to know how learning happens, but to actually do something about that.
Right.
Is focus on quality teaching if you're going to have a teacher. And this one isn't really popular, but it's this idea that we really have to stop doing the things that we don't know work, or worse, are actually harmful. We've not stepped up. We've just not stepped up. In my 40 years of working in international schools, we haven't stepped up. I'm sorry, it's a bit of an indictment. I get the privilege, the opportunity to work in many schools every year, both myself when I was full-time in school and leadership, and as a teacher, et cetera. And now for the past many years alongside that, helping to run organizations that can help other people do this. I have to say, you see things that are at best neutral. They're not on top of it.
Do you mind giving an example of something that you've seen that we need to step up?
Absolutely. I've got a long list, but I'm going to keep to the short one. Yeah, thank you, because you're anticipating exactly what I wanted to talk about. So I think the big idea is everybody who's listening, if you think of your own school, there are things that you are doing that minimally, they don't work. And other things, which if you're following the research, which you should be doing as a leader, they're harmful. So for some examples of those are measuring student learning by year. Learning doesn't happen by year, but our assessment schemes, our whole setup, our whole calendar, calendars are a really powerful thing in schools. When you release yourself from the idea that learning has to be organized around a year, all kinds of magical things can happen. So that would be an example. I worked myself in a school district in the United States that was year-round school, but it was not for the right reasons. But guess what? It worked better. But you say that we do lots of governance training now and as part of our organization, and you try to persuade anybody that year-round school is a good idea. There's other things that are way more sacred than learning, like summer holidays. That would be an example. I think organizing the curriculum around subjects is doing harm. There may be some that it may be useful for, but to go with that epistemology all these decades later, not just because it's all these decades later, but because it's not realistic. It is not contextualized to the purpose of schooling, which is to prepare you for a productive life of contributing and of service and of happiness. That doesn't come in subject categories, right? So that's another one. Another one would be teaching all the curriculum in the same context. For example, you have your set of learning standards. Let's say one of them is reading. And we just assume that we're still going to just put all the 19 kids in the same room to learn how to read. I don't know about you. Putting a kid who doesn't read in a room with 19 other kids who also don't read is not optimal. And nobody in their right sense would do that. But the system has already overtaken us. So teaching the curriculum all in the same way without context, that's another one. Decontextualizing learning, it's deadly. It's really deadly. It won't stick anyway, which is probably a good thing because we never learned it in context. If there's one learning kind of underpinning, it would be that one. The brain needs context for learning. And when we lack context, we really are in trouble. We can get short-term and even mid-term memory, but it's not learning. So learning only happens when we can only see learning, when we see it turned into applying it somewhere. But stopping the things that are harmful. And guess what? That means that the leader has to be good at spotting those and has to know something. One of the reasons that we started the PTC was in the international setting. I remember myself standing in the door of my office in my first principalship, thinking, all the kids are here and all the teachers are here. We've done all this stuff. Now what? Now what do I do? What am I supposed to do now? What is this job? And how is what I'm going to do going to have any influence on all these kids that are now here sort of counting on us? You have to know. And that means just constant learning.
I'm so glad that you're talking about leadership, because what's frustrating to me, and I think you would agree with this, we've been talking a good game and we've known what doesn't work for such a long time. And yet here we are. The leadership and the educational courage that it takes to actually go after research and make really important changes in your school is so hard to do. There's structures in place. There's parent body in place. It's just such a heavy lift, and it's so easy to do what's always been done. And the courage that it takes for a leader to go after the things that will really move education forward, it just hasn't happened at the rate that I would imagine that we've all wanted it to. I mean, it's been 15 years since we talked about this in PTC and when I was there, and it's frustrating.
It's hard to change culture. It's easy to talk about what could be. What you're highlighting today is we need to change what we know is not doing well in our schools, and it's actually hindering us or preventing us from moving forward.
Well, that's what I like about the PTC and AISH is you said at the beginning of the show is that you're trying to take these blue sky vision sentiments and put them into actionable pieces that schools can use to do this. So that's what the PTC and AISH, that's why it's so important to our educational world, because that's part of the way forward, is to have people in a room working together to find out how we can actually put this into action.
Yeah, it's all about that, because what good is it? Something that begins and ends in words is not very helpful to anybody, except for maybe the fun of talking about it for a few minutes. That's, the whole idea of Blue Sky was like, remove the barriers, let yourself free. But there has to be a next step. There's knowledge. You have to have some knowledge. Then comes volition, the commitment to make a decision to do something. And then comes action. So it's knowledge, volition, and action. And we're pretty good at playing around the edges of maybe not even the knowledge part. I'm a little bit stunned sometimes about the willingness of, I'm sorry, I'm going to just tell it like it is.
Do it.
But the willingness of leaders to just do the soft stuff. Well-being, taking care of everybody. My whole existence has been in the international schools. We have a very privileged bubble that we live in. We now mask that in building community. And I think it's a mask. Our little community, we're continuing to build the bubble around us. And there's nothing wrong with that bubble, but just be realistic. These kids are privileged kids. We are privileged people to work in these places. So what? What about that? Do we have any responsibility or not? Step up and stop moaning about it. And it's not just courage, because the system, if it was just about courage, if that was the only ingredients, then the system would be flexible enough to support courage. The issue seems to me that the system itself is already an obstacle. So I'm a mathematics and science person background. We need to switch it up. Right now, we've got the system, and we say, what learning can we get out of that system? So we put a bunch of kids in a space, a certain amount of time, at the same ages, certain subjects, and we throw it at them, and we make sure that they're busy from 7 a.m. until 5 p.m. That's the babysitting premise, Take that away. If you just took that one away, you would be in a very different place. So these are the premises. And then we say, well, let's see what learning we can get out of it. And we try to retrofit the learning. So you remember your constants and variables lesson that you learned in grade 7? So switch it up. Let's say the constant is learning, and everything else is a variable, and everything is up for grabs. As we learn which of those variables and which combination of them are going to produce more and better learning for every kid every single hour.
You haven't even talked about grades yet, which I'm sure are averages. So we'll leave that one alone for another podcast.
Well, that's another example, right?
Yeah.
I decided early on in my career to be learned about was assessment. It all lands there. No matter whatever good stuff you did or didn't do in the classroom, in the end, it was all kind of reduced down to somebody measuring it in a very small metric. And then good and bad things happen to you, whatever that metric was. That's just a really strong example of the system. I've been doing this long enough to know, I'm not trying to blow it up. So I say, back it up and say, what are those key practices? A leader has to be good at those. The context in which we are operating, we call ourselves international schools. The concept that really drives most of our practice, and should drive it, is independent. We are independent to do what we think is right around our mission. We are free of some of the fetters of non-independence. You both live in a country that I don't know all the rules about Vietnam, but there's not as many constraints as there might be, let's say, in a country in Europe. And we can't keep making excuses about the fact that if we cannot make these things happen in this independent, international, resource-rich school, I don't know where we think this is going to happen. But we keep playing around the edges of it. Other things that I think we need to prioritize: push the envelope. You don't get anywhere if you just stay in that box and the leader's not willing. It isn't even courage. It's just knowing that that's part of leadership. You don't just get to stay in the box and manage in there. So another one, I think it could be transformational, is that we need to start valuing dispositions at least equal to, if not more than, content knowledge and the competencies and understandings. You need all of those things in order to have a disposition. You need to know something, and you need to have an opinion about it, and you need to have an approach to it. As long as we continue to graduate obnoxious 12th graders, we have not accomplished this.
Now that the tables have turned and we have the internet with AI and critical thinking skills, those things that we need to, in an information attention society, those are the things that are going to make students thrive. I love your passion. Over 40 years, how did you start in international education?
I was one of those nerd kids who just decided early on that I wanted to be a teacher. And so I did that. And I couldn't decide what I wanted to do. So I just did all of the different things that you could get, all the way from preschool to high school, et cetera. And then eventually landed in the secondary because somebody told me that if you did maths and science, you'd always have a job. So I said, okay, I can do that. I will do that. So I've told that story many times. And so that's what I did. I actually got into international education pretty early when my husband took a job in Portugal. And I had 3 little kids, and I had been teaching in California, where we were living at the time. I knew nothing about international schools, nothing at all. And there was no internet. It's a long time ago. Kind of went on a wing and a prayer, and off you went. Lo and behold, I had every intention of putting my kids, they were really small. They were like 3, 5, and 7 or something like that. Just put them into local schools. Why not? Didn't know the language or anything, but they were really small. Only to realize that when we arrived there on the 12th of January, the schools had not opened yet for the year. It's not like they were closed for the holidays or something. So I figured this is not good. Once I found a school for my kids, it was just, I'll get a job. So it was a local hire when I started, and then it went on from there.
Wow, it's been a journey since.
Mm-hmm.
I'm really interested in the Principals Training Center and the International Educator and Academy for International School Heads, those 3 specific organizations that you founded or co-founded, but had. Can you just maybe talk about the genesis behind those? Was it something that you saw that was lacking in the international school world, or was it really the idea of developing leadership with that spirit of reciprocity to bring the international world together?
Yeah, sure. First, I want to just acknowledge Forrest Broman, who was really one of the masterminds behind at least a couple of these organizations. And yes, I think that it starts with noticing. You notice, I've been teaching my grandchildren. I realized a while back that I'm not sure what they would say if anybody asked them, what did your grandmother teach you? So I decided to start coming up with things. And the very first thing that I said, well, my first piece of advice is notice. You have to notice. You can't do anything if you don't notice.
Yeah.
And that's actually turned out to be actually true. And what does noticing look like, in the education world? Some of us, me, were quite enthusiastic about this vision that you are trying to pursue here and get people's ideas on with Blue Sky. What does that look like? We quickly moved from just noticing. I would say none of these things were new, but they were better ways, we thought, to do them. We started with this overarching idea after noticing that, things weren't going really well in certain areas. And then we quickly moved to this sort of overarching purpose that what things could you do in a school that you currently aren't doing that could have an impact on kids? Really always had this underpinning of impact, and not straying from that too far. But each of them had a sort of a different starting point. TIE, the International Educator, which was first, just by a year or so, was pretty simple. There was just no way for people who had jobs to get the word out. There was one, maybe Times Educational Supplement, but it wasn't an international trade journal or anything. And then there were people who wanted jobs. Okay. And this was, there were some recruitment fairs and things, but they're very clunky. And, there was no way to get things out. Everything was snail mail. There was no internet. What did we do? We knew that there was a thing called a newspaper, and that's where people advertised jobs, just that there wasn't one for international educators. So that's how that one got started. And then, of course, it was a newspaper, so you also had to have news alongside the ads. We started as a nonprofit. We're still a nonprofit. We didn't want anybody to think that we were trying to take advantage of colleagues in any way. It was just genuinely of service. But it's still a business. You got to run it.
Right.
So that was TIE, but it was also became a way to build community.
If we could talk about that, my first school, I saw that paper on the faculty table, and it was just a window to the international school world. Wow, there's a school in Khartoum. There's a school in India. I'd never heard of these schools, and it was exciting. And I joked with Dan, I was like, how am I going to get to all of these schools? Like, how am I going to work in all of these schools one day?
We've tried.
we have tried. We've worked our way around the world. It is true. It was a piece of newspaper that was building community amongst us all. And I want to thank you and Forrest for having the capacity to build that. To this day, look forward to getting the digital version just to see what other people are up to. So thank you for that.
I've stolen it a number of times out of the faculty lounge and just spent hours dreaming about what that might look like. I had no idea. I got on a plane to Abu Dhabi and I thought it was called Abu Dubai. I had no idea where I was going. And that paper opened up my mind to not just international schools, but my life and what that could look like. Yeah. Anyway, listen, we have so many fond memories. Letting everybody, all of our listeners know who's been around the educational world for a long time internationally, they know exactly what we're talking about.
These things evolve. There was no need any longer for a print newspaper, and it was causing more, so there's an evolution to these things too. And you have to be really wary of, are we still adding value? Or are we beating a dead horse here? Because things have changed. Things have definitely moved on. There's a million ways now to find out where jobs are, et cetera. So that was TIE, and that was pretty straightforward.
The other thing I'd like to say about TIE, it was always a way, and probably maybe more so for me over the last 10, 15 years, it was such a deep source of professional development because the articles I would read and the initiatives that were happening at other great schools and the kinds of things that were research-based and research-driven really helped frame my leadership and my thinking. I'm fortunate enough to be able to blog on TIE for a number of years, and not just putting that content out, but getting responses from people all over the world that really sharpened my saw and let me sort of think about who I was as a leader and the approaches I would take to schools. That professional development piece from TIE has been immeasurable.
Well, and you've made a huge contribution, Dan. Every one of them started with so.
Yeah, no, I still catch flack on that.
So today, and you made a huge contribution, and that's a good example of community building. We talk about community building and how critical it is for people to belong, et cetera, et cetera. But then there are people who actually do things, practical things. I think TIE was one of those, and our TIE bloggers and our TIE article writers and people stepping up. It is creating a way for people to do that as well that's accessible. Mm-hmm. We've had ups and downs, as you know, not in terms of, the service of it, but just what it stands for, et cetera, et cetera. None of them come problem-free. They're not blue sky in that sense. The PTC was really on the backs of Harvard and ECIS 1 year in the mid-'80s. There was already a principals training center at Harvard Graduate School of Ed when Roland Barth was running it way back. And he's written quite a lot. That's why I mentioned his name here. He hasn't in many, many years, but he was very kind of foundational for some of these things. They had a thing called the Principals Training Center. And the ECIS got together with them and they put on a couple of summers where it was just a one-off, was very different than what we ended up doing. But I went to one of those. I thought, this is a really good idea for principals to be talking to other principals, bring them together, because they only ever had one or two or three in a school. Unlike teachers who have a bunch of teachers, there's only one or two of them. We determined that the context of the international school was different enough. There was a skill set enough that it was probably a good idea to help people with that skill set. The premise continues to be that today. In the international setting,
right?
How do you do this skill? Aish was another one. It was one of those lunchtime conversations with somebody, one of our friends in Massachusetts, who was a superintendent of the school. And he was saying, I got to go now because I'm going to the meeting of all the superintendents in Massachusetts. And we looked at each other. We said, well, that's a good idea.
Let's do that for the whole world.
Yeah. With Forrest the way he is, he's a Harvard lawyer. He just, So by 2 days later, we sort of had the draft, just drew up the papers and off we went. Wow. Created the third nonprofit and on our way. Back to what you said, Dan, it was not like a new idea in that sense, but it was sort of a problem or a refinement or a contextual contribution.
Thinking back when you first started those organizations, did it evolve the way that you had hoped? Did the vision come true? Because the way I see it, I mean, I'm not sure you have many international educators around the world who don't either haven't been part of the PTC, understand the international educator, or aren't through their career looking to go to AISH in some regard. Like that has exploded.
I don't think that you really can ever predict that. You're sitting today in the future and you think in 10 years or 5 years down the road. We're very much about solving things today.
Okay.
For whoever felt they needed it solved. Our mission is to reach as many people who need help in the international schools world as we can. Really, how they evolve is through your response to the changing needs. I think if you keep your eye on the needs as well, the one hand, it's trying to get really good at perceiving need. And then the other one is sort of the Steve Jobs approach, which is, here's some stuff that these people don't even know they need. And that's the kind of the blue sky part of it. So we have our strategy meetings are like that. Well, what are people needing right now? And how do we know? So we do 10 to 15 hours a week of research, reading. And I think it's more just keeping your eye on the ball. Who knew?
Yeah.
I think that's true for schools. I think it's true for everybody. When I started, like there was one and everybody came, we built it and they came. Most cities now, it's competitive pretty much everywhere you go. So you really have to get good at what is your distinctive competence. And you have to get good at communicating that. What is your value proposition? And how is that different than the people down the street? Are you going to do what everybody else does cheaper? Or are you going to do what everybody else does, but for better quality? Or are you going to do something that nobody else is doing? Those are 3 examples of a value proposition that all international schools, because they are fee-paying schools and independent, have to deal with. They can't walk away from it. And we're in there trying to help with the practical solutions.
Absolutely. You've done so much for TIE, AISH, PTC, but you're also doing a lot of work for less privileged schools and children across the globe as part of your strategic initiatives.
We started that work 12 or 15 years ago. The earthquake happened in Haiti. And we decided then, same kind of conversations that we're always having around in our house. It's like, what do we know how to do that could help here? We don't try to pretend that we know something. We don't know how to do it. We know how to do schools. So let's see if we can help. That was the first contribution that we get all the kids in schools around the world to say, let's all do something together. We'll do the brunt of the work. Just help us out. And we did it. And so we opened that school. The first kids have graduated. Every single kid did sterlingly well. Really, there were just kids hanging on the gate of the little house that we rented. How do you let them in? What are the criteria? Just said, who needs the most help? And so that's who they came in. And we ended up with a cohort of a couple hundred kids. We weren't able to grow the school. We just had cohorts that went through because that's what we could do. So that was the beginning of it. We're not doing it in a big enough way for my liking yet. The thing is, do we or do we not have an obligation in this privileged world of the international school to help impact that system and make it better? I think there's something bigger that all of us together, I think we have a responsibility to it. I think these are the places where we can grow the new strategies, where we can take those risks. So some of the things that we're doing right now, one of them is not really about just underprivileged or anything. It's just this idea that if they're going to be teachers, there should be international standards around the world, not just in international schools, so that every kid gets access. So we're doing work to try to kind of socialize that. We put together some tools. One of them is called the Growth and Appraisal Tool, which we're running right now through our organizations to start holding ourselves up to a higher level of accountability. We are going to continue to think about other possible ways to do this. We're thinking about curriculum. We've got a curriculum that we're writing that has to do with how do you teach kids to talk to each other in ways that they don't become like the adults that we now have in the world. And so we're a long way down the road with one of our Thai editorial team members, Jolene Durama. She's helping us to write that curriculum. Not maybe the typical things that you might be thinking that we're going to go and, start schools and give money and things like that, but more from the tools that we've developed over the years, assessment schemes. So we're going to really try to be influential in national markets and national systems. We've already had some invitations to work within some national systems. We're just doing the strategizing.
Well, I like that. This is exactly what you talked about, just looking at what the needs are in the global landscape now. You saw the needs back with the organizations you set up, and now the next evolution is looking at the needs of where we are as an international school world and what do we need as a global society. I want to come back to one of the things you said earlier, which really resonated to me, is how it's not necessarily about educating and graduating good students. It's really the idea of graduating good human beings and people for our world, right? And that disposition piece that I think that you and your team will go after, and hopefully international schools will follow suit.
There's no parent in the world who wants their kid to be taught to be dishonest. Grant Wiggins used to talk about this all the time. What's the alternative to equity? Inequity? Is that what we should be teaching? The idea that when you kind of turn it around and say the principle of equity, the principle of inclusion, the principle of justice, everybody's for those. I don't know anybody who's not for those things. It's just when they become a thing that they start to do more harm than good. And our kids, they're getting the message that it's more important for you to know things and know them better than the person sitting next to you, as measured in weird ways, than it is for you to be a kind person. And we've been talking about this forever. This is not new. Schools from the beginning, they were all about getting smart and getting good. That's what they were always about. They always had that. We just always preferred the smart and hoped that they'd get the good just from other circumstances. And indeed, they probably do. But are we about amplifying that, or are we not? It's not going to be that hard to do. The kids, because they're human beings, they will get it. We've created a system. We've decided for them that it's more important that they know these things and can do mathematical equations. We've decided that for them. Ask them. They don't think that's important. They all say the right things. They all say, of course, you should be kind. But I'm still going to rip that page out of the book so they can't read it.
One last question, and then we'll let you get back to Nashville. There's a lot of new leaders coming up. There's a lot of leaders who've been around in schools a long time, and maybe pieces of advice or messages now. I did hear you say it's not just about courage, although courage counts. It is about analyzing the systems and doing your research and acting on the things that we know we're doing in schools and have always done that just either are hurting kids or are not working. Is that the message? Be the leader who looks at those things and makes changes when you know they're needed?
Those are definitely things, but there's also one thing that I often say is become an expert at something that matters in the world of schooling. Mine happened to be, I chose assessment for the reasons that I sort of spoke about before. You have to be leading something. Leading is just not a thing unless you're leading something to go somewhere. There are only three things that we do in school. We figure out what's worth learning. So there's the what of learning, and who's deciding that in your school? We decide how kids are going to learn. 4 sciences of learning now that are contributing to us understanding that piece. Are you going to be an expert in that? And or are you going to become an expert on how do we know anybody's learned anything? That's the only 3 things we do. And there's only one reason that we would change any of those things. And that's because we're not satisfied with the learning results that we're getting. We think our program should produce more and better learning than what we're getting. That's it. Get to be good at one of those things and show people that they need your leadership. Just get good at spotting when the things that you are doing are or are not having an impact on learning. You have to measure your own leadership acts also against, are they or are they not having an impact on learning? If not, then why am I doing them? Or do I need to do them differently?
What do the next few months look like for you, Bambi? What's coming up?
We're doing a lot of work with the Governance Training Center. Since the creation of the Principals Training Center, there's been several others. So we've started the Teacher Training Center, the Teacher Leader Institute, which is going gangbusters. That was one where we got the need right. We looked out about 15 years ago and said, the people who are really doing the work here are the grade level leaders and the department heads, et cetera. Now we're year round. We have a course running every single day of the year, minus about 6. So for teacher leaders, for counselors, and for governance now, and some of our teacher things, all of those are now online. That seems to be the way people want to do it now. So that's what we're doing. And this is our 3rd year of doing that. So we're running courses. We've got one cultures course coming up for counseling. All the stuff is on the website if people want to go and see it. And I think the one that we're running right now is coaching, that we're doing coaching and supervising for teacher leaders. It's a big schedule. So that's still ongoing right up until, the end of May, beginning of June. Every month we do something for governance, which has been another one where we thought there's a need out there. It's the same message they've been getting for decades. And there's some new messages that need to get out there. And also all kinds of new forms of ownership of schools, which are changing the governance, and the governance are the policymakers. So they need to understand what policy needs to look like, strategic policy. At least once a month, if not twice, we're doing governance, and almost every day of the week, we're doing something with the teacher leaders, counselors, et cetera. Top it all off, back to the summer. We run, I don't know how many courses next summer, both online and in person in Lisbon. So that's what's coming up. And rewriting all the courses every year.
Oh, wow. New people into the national world, they can find you ptc.org. Is it Thai Online? ThaiOnline.com. Yep.
And then Asia is a separate thing. I mean, we spun that off, but it's the Academy for International Schools. They have their own organization now.
Okay. Well, they can find you. Bambi, listen, you're probably not going to like this, but I want to say a deep and heartfelt thank you, not only on behalf of Daniel and myself, but for the international school world, for what you've given to so many people and the impact that you've had throughout international education on people's lives as well has been immeasurable. And I just want to thank you for showing us all not what good looks like, but what great looks like. And you've been inspiring, and you've inspired me. I know you've inspired Daniel, but you're a gift. And thank you for spending time with us today. It's just been a joy.
I want to just thank you for the opportunity. It's always a joy to talk to educators who are all there for one reason, and that's for our kids. Even as platitude as that sounds, it's the real deal. So thank you for that.
Thank you, Bambi.
Be well. Talk to you soon.
You too.
Thank you for listening to the Blue Skies Leadership Podcast. Do you know a specific leader who would be a great guest? Fill out all the details at blueskiesleadership.com.